Our guest today is Simon Brown, and if you've ever drawn boxes and arrows to explain a software system, you probably run into his work. Simon is the creator of the popular C4 model of software architecture, a simple way to map software architecture at 4 levels of detail, from the big picture all the way down to the code. He's also the founder of Structurizer, the original diagrams as code tooling, and he spent 15 plus years helping teams in around 40 countries draw software other people can actually read and understand. In this episode, we start with the origin story of C4, an origin story Simon calls boring, but I think is pretty interesting, and how it grew out of the architecture diagrams Simon used to sketch for his own day job. We get into why software architects are suddenly back in 2026 after years of being declared dead or outmoded. We talk about why he refused to build a drag and drop editor for his Structurizer tool and why plain text turned out to be exactly what the AI era needed. And we close with the diagrams he thinks everyone sleeps on. What are the parts of C4 that aren't getting enough light? Plus, there's a little bit of a bonus take on how developer cultures differ on either side of the Atlantic pond. This is episode 7 of Hardboiled Software with Simon Brown. All right. Welcome, Simon Brown, to the Hardboiled Software Podcast. So excited to see you here, old friend. It hasn't been that long, actually. We ran into each other last year, I think, in Atlanta.
Yeah, almost this time last year.
Yeah. So I do enjoy you looking us up when you come down. We got to spend a nice lunch and afternoon walk with you and your wife. But yeah, good to see you again, man. Wanted to get you on this podcast because I think as we kind of develop the purpose of this podcast and what it is, our organizing principle is very simple. People who have created work that I leverage in my day-to-day and I think deserve, I would like to kind of create a record of and just highlight as much as possible. That said, I'd love to kind of get into the origin of C4 story because I was sharing this brief anecdote with you earlier. I was in Mumbai a couple weeks ago and I'm looking at the whiteboard and I'm like, that's C4 model. And they had kind of a system context. So I'm like, the spread and the reach has gotten pretty far, but I just love to kind of get the quick origin story and maybe some of the moments where it started to pop and become popular as it is now. Yeah.
The origin story is actually really boring. So I used to run software architecture workshops in London. Let me backtrack. I used to work for a bunch of consulting companies in London, small consulting companies. And if you want to grow your consulting companies, you need more tech leads, more architects to lead more teams to grow your consulting company. So I started teaching people how to move into tech lead and architecture roles. That was inside the company. And then took that content outside. I did some workshops with a friend for the QCon conference. And then I did some stuff with Skills Matter, which I think is where we met originally, right? And I ran these workshops at Skills Matter. They were architecture for developers workshops, architecture charters. Here are some requirements, do some design, draw some pictures. This was about 2006-ish. And I realized very quickly as the person running the workshop, I could not understand anybody's pictures. They were just completely meaningless to me. Now, of course, UML's already on its way out. Agile's come along and taken UML away. And there was no appetite for people to learn UML. So I thought, how can I teach people how to draw better software architecture diagrams? And the answer was, I'll just teach them how I do it in the office. And that's it. So SQL4 is really just a formalization of the block diagrams that I used to draw in a kind of post-UML world for my own day job. That's it. And it's really just been formalized over the years as we've got feedback and kind of shaped it and had a lot more people learn it, go through it. So that's it, really. That's the origin story.
Yeah, maybe for some of our listeners that are maybe unfamiliar or new to C4, can you kind of just walk through what you think are like the kind of innovations that make it approachable to someone coming in from the outside, or these things more navigable, or what separates them from traditional, I think about old school Visio, or if you remember that, or like Lucid, maybe more modern diagrams today.
I think innovation might be stretching it somewhat, but I can tell you what makes it kind of works. You've probably seen an architecture diagram and it's just everything on one page. Like literally everything. The high level diagram, you've got all the components of that kind of inside the applications. You've got some cloud stuff going on, like literally just everything. C4 really just breaks this down and says, right, let's focus on one level of detail at a time. So we start with the system context diagram, which is like, well, here's the thing you are building as a single box in the middle. Tell me who uses it, what they do, and tell me about your system to system integration points. And that's essentially the C4 system context diagram. It's just a nice kind of scoping and context setting diagram. And then you really take the kind of Google Maps approach and you pinch the zoom on that central box and you open up to show the applications and data source that sit inside and reside inside the software system you are building. And it's just a fractal approach. You kind of keep going down until you get to the code. And there are 4 levels of abstraction, hence the name is C4. So is it innovative? Not really, but it's putting some structure around what many people might have done naturally, but didn't have a way to communicate those levels of abstraction. That's the thing there. It's giving some predefined levels of abstraction that we as an industry can use to talk about the same thing. That's it.
Yeah. That's cool. I mean, I think our listeners will detect as we talk. I have a very American hypey way of talking about your work, and you have a very humble and kind of plain spoken way. Maybe we'll get into some of those cultural differences because I've observed them as I have had travels out, your direction. So C4, so you've got like the system context, maybe even above that, like system landscape. That's the kind of high level. And then we go into components, which are kind of runtimes and stacks and things like that. And that's how I think of it. And then we go down into, containers, right? And then we go down to components, which is like, okay, the logical architecture. And like each level seems to have a different audience, maybe that like it drills down, it gets more developer-y as you go down, whereas like higher levels, even leaders can understand. Like the container level is like, I feel like a lot of infra people, architecture folks, DevOpsy people tend to understand and such. Does anyone really go down to the code level of diagramming? Is that, I find myself not really doing that.
Same here. I think I've done it like once.
Yeah.
Even the third level components is not, I would say, widely used in my experience. This raises the question, why is it called C4 and not C2 plus 2 more optional levels? But that's a whole different story.
Yeah. You pick a name and at some point you just inertia, right, takes over.
Yeah.
I found component diagrams to be kind of useful in certain use cases, particularly where you've got kind of a monolith and you're planning an extraction of some kind of workload, like some microservice, something like that. You're starting to break that up, whether that's in process or out of process. That's tends to be where I found value with the component, but
same. It's very useful if you are designing a new monolith on a blank sheet of paper and you've got like a small to medium sized monolith and you just want to say, here's how I think we should arrange the things inside the application, kind of broad strokes, high level structures. But yeah, it's not often used, to be fair.
Well, I'll go into hype mode for a second. I'll say one of the side effects, we'll call it a positive externality, not an innovation. Just, I don't want to make you so uncomfortable at the beginning of this. But a positive side benefit is it seems like C4 kind of naturally comes with a little bit of a social process, right? That maybe it's just making these things a little bit more legible and understood and intentionally deciding which level of abstraction you are invites more people to the party, so to speak. Like that's been my experience, is like all the other architectural diagrams were done in an ivory tower and they just seem like they come and people kind of glaze over, multitask or whatever. It seems like C4 actually gets people to look at it a little bit more and comment on it and talk about it. No, that's not right. This is not right. You've done 11 billion of these things. There's the hype again. Have you noticed this? Like, you're in a workshop setting, which is a social process into itself, but like, what's your experience around the practice of C4?
Yeah, it's definitely a much more inclusive way to describe architecture, different levels of abstraction. Because those kind of Uber diagrams, where you show everything, they put so many people off. The non-techies are not interested because there's way too much going on. The infrastructure people are not interested because there's a little bit of infrastructure there, but it's mostly other stuff they've never heard of. Your product owners and don't care, of course. C4 kind of slices this up into smaller digestible chunks, I guess. And you're right, that seems to invite more discussion. So I've run workshops and we've had user experience designers, reviewers working on things like the context diagram, which they might not have done before. So this raises the question, why are the UX people interested in the context diagram? And the answer is they're thinking about the user experience, aren't they? They're thinking about how are people using this piece of software to achieve whatever goal they're trying to achieve. So they're really interested from the kind of user angle. And you're definitely right about the kind of DevOpsy, infrastructure people. They love the container diagram. We've seen all this talk about DevOps in the past, of course. And what I've actually noticed is that the dev people speak one language and the ops people speak a different language. And although they want to do DevOps, there's still this gap in the middle where the dev and the ops people can't communicate. And it turns out the C4 container diagram is a brilliant way to bring these folks together. And I've had network engineers and infrastructure engineers on my workshops, and they've said to me at the end, now we finally understand what the devs do. So when the devs hand these artifacts over, this is the set of stuff that we need to monitor, observe, run, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, it's definitely done that.
I love that idea that architecture is kind of this maybe cross-cutting capability that can kind of unite those different perspectives that need to be kind of pushed toward the same goal. I think that's really amazing. I think for a long time, I think certainly when you and I met, there was this kind of simmering, backlash around architecture. Like there was this, non-coding architects and ivory tower architects and all these like really loudmouth developers like me and a bunch of other people were like, end this now, and it seems like architecture was headed toward this dead end thing. I mean, it's something we have to do and be mindful of, but it seemed like it was going more into as developers started to become called engineers, part of the engineering job. And what's really weird is now in 2026, I'm seeing architect roles come back in our clients and stuff like that. So I call this like the architecture revival. What's going on? What's up with that, Simon? Like, do you have any theories as to why it's swing? I mean, everyththing's a pendulum, right? But why is that coming back? Like, yeah.
Yeah. So I have two theories on this. The first one is, and you're exactly right. If we go back, best part of 20 years, there was a big backlash against architects, especially those ivory tower architects that didn't want to write code, were not interested in implementation details, et cetera, et cetera. You mentioned the word simmering. I think it was much more than simmering. There was a lot of angst out there against architecture. But plowing my own course here. So Agile came along and kind of killed lots of that stuff because they were just trying to move fast and just do refactoring and TDD and all that kind of good XP stuff, of course. And I think a lot of organizations went too far. So they were doing big upfront design. They were doing big tech specs. They were doing all of that stuff. And then Agile comes along and they realize, hey, we don't need to do this because Agile says we should value working software over comprehensive documentation. So they went to the other extreme, did that for 10 years. And now they realize they went too far. And I've visited organizations who have failed compliance audits. They don't have enough documentation. They have lots of tribal knowledge kind of kicking around in silos. They don't know how anything works. Yet this software is literally running their entire business. So certainly in the past, I'm going to say 10 years, maybe not even that, maybe like 5 to 10 years, that sort of period, where organizations have realized, hey, this is an issue. We need to bring some structure back. So they've been looking into lightweight architectural techniques, should we say. I actually think COVID had a little bit of influence here. Everybody's now working from home during the pandemic. Those water cooler conversations are much more difficult to have. There's a lot less kind of like unconscious knowledge transfer, if that's a term. So that's kind of one angle. And that's probably the more predominant one I've seen over the past 5 or 10 years. The most recent, and this is my second theory, the most recent move towards reintroducing architecture is because of the whole AI and vibe coding thing. Because these AIs and LLMs are producing thousands and thousands of lines of code, and no one knows what they do. No one knows how to review them. No one knows how to fit them into their existing applications. And that whole thing is just becoming a mess. And I think people are realizing that there is some value in doing some planning work now. Not months and years worth of planning, but some planning to kind of get this thing into some structured way of working. So yeah, those are my two theories.
Those are good theories. I really see planning as kind of everything's shifting left, like on the value stream. Like it really feels like the planning and also the feedback loops that you're kind of putting in place are getting a lot more attention, which is great in a way. Like essentially coming to an LLM with a good lucid plan and then saying, hey, here's a little slice that I want to develop, and then pause and review. That's kind of what I mean by the feedback loop. And I see I'm experiencing really good results with that in my workflow, but it definitely pushes toward left side of the value stream and the planning stuff. Although, we've been shifting left for a long time. It's like now it's shifting left into architecture, higher order things like architecture, product, those kind of conversations. Yeah. Interesting. So maybe a little bit like on C4, how do you see teams? We don't necessarily go down the agile route, but let's go up a level from just say workflow, right? Where does C4 fit into workflows? How are you seeing your clients kind of use it like across the spectrum of ideation from concept to cash? Where does it fit in?
Literally everywhere. So, from the initial ideation, exploration workshops, scoping workshops, analysis, all of that type of stuff, the C4 context and container diagrams are super useful. No fancy tools needed, whiteboard, piece of paper, Miro, mural, whatever you want to use. So there's lots of C4 stuff being done then. It doesn't need to be super detailed or super neat. You can just have these things as sketches on whiteboards. That's absolutely fine. And then I've seen people really switch tools and move to electronic tools when they want to start creating longer lived documentation, which is then hopefully maintained throughout the lifetime of the product. Of course, a lot of that is by hand, but we are seeing people experiment with AI to detect architectural drift and change the diagrams as the code base is evolving. So that's quite cool as well.
Interesting. So is there, and I think you described kind of two treatments or two ways of handling these diagrams. One is kind of more an ephemeral, maybe part of technical discovery. We're about to do something ambitious or fresh or new, or something maybe in a system that is a little older and we just want to plot a route path through it or something like that, or be able to point to a visual. That is kind of like a situational like application of it. And then you described like, okay, using AI and LLMs to maintain and update and keep the diagrams fresh. Like what are your recommendations in terms of the maintenance side of that? And do you think that there's value in kind of maintaining a set of diagrams throughout the life cycle of a product?
So there are kind of two questions interlinked there, aren't there? So I'm going to try and tease the two questions apart.
Okay.
Do I think it's worth keeping documentation? Yes. Again, if you go back 10, 15 years when Agile was going through its kind of peak years, I heard a lot of people say to my face, we don't need diagrams as long-lived artifacts. The value's in the conversation. So they're of course talking to having a whiteboard session, a bunch of people sketching some ideas on a whiteboard. The value is not in the actual physical diagrams, take photos and all that, put them on Confluence. But the benefit is having the conversations and aligning those mindsets. Now, there are some big issues with that whole thing because people are interpreting the diagrams differently, so there's no alignment going on anyway. But let's push that to one side. To come back to the question, is it worth having some diagrams? Yeah, absolutely. Because every time somebody new just joins, if you don't have any diagrams, you've got to go to the whiteboard and redraw the whole thing again. And you're probably going to draw something slightly different than you did last week when the other new joiner started. So I think having some diagrams is just going to save you time. Now, of course, one of the traps we've fallen into before is we have this vast array of diagrams. And because they take so long to update, we just don't bother. And that's why it says last updated in 1999 or something on the bottom. So that's why my recommendation with C4 is really focus on the top two levels, the context and the container diagrams, because they're reasonably quick to draw and they don't age rapidly. I mean, there are some caveats here. If you're building like a very distributed functions as a service style architecture, then those things are modeled as containers, so you get quite a lot of volatility there. But in most cases, those two levels of diagrams don't change that rapidly. So that gives you a better basis on which to kind of have your longer lived documentation. In terms of keeping them up to date, the other question, you got two options. Option one is just do it. And that sounds very flippant and blasé, but that is literally just the best approach. Just treat it as part of your culture, as part of your process. If you're doing like a pull request style of development and you have a definition of done for your work items, just add a line to the bottom. Have we updated the diagrams and docs given the change set that we are making? If you can keep all of your diagrams as docs as code in the Git repo, for example, then all of these things are literally part of one change set. Again, tooling can help or hinder here. If you've got like a cloud-based wiki that you have to go and edit separately and it's separate to the change set, there's some friction there. And of course, the other option is to use automation to keep these artifacts up to date. Whether you have written some code yourself to reverse engineer your cloud environment or your code base using static analysis, whatever it is, to kind of automate the creation of that model, or using LLMs to try and detect architectural drift. So yeah, awesome. A bunch of different options there.
Yeah, nice. I like it. I feel like the relying on people's discipline and rigor, which was always one of the weak points of the software craft movement. It was like, just discipline harder, just do it harder. Like it's pretty big ask to, unless people see the value in what they're doing and kind of can condition to where that's not a big lift. Like it's kind of why XP didn't take off. It's kind of why, a number of these things that we've, just it's a non-starter. So you mentioned like LLMs and documentations as code, and this is, I think, a good opportunity to kind of pivot a little bit into the ecosystem that you've built around your POV. Recently, I caught on LinkedIn. I love it anytime someone who's a really legit product owner, says no. I think that's a really hard thing to do in that role with the pressure that's on you. But I love that you said no to a WYSIWYG creator, editor of the C4. You have this model notation, the structurizer notation, this DSL that can just be checked in and version controlled, and can be reasonably version controlled. It's not some big like SVG, big pile of XML. It's very lucid and easy to understand. It uses the words you think it would use. You can almost kind of write it and just without knowing it, and it works. Like, so you said no GUI. We're going to use docs as code. Why no?
So I guess thing number one, I'm a developer and I like coding and I like text and I like tools and version control and diffs and all that sort of stuff. So that is a big influence to my point of view there. Some of the early versions of my structurizer tooling did have a UI. So you'd open up the canvas and you would add elements and relationships and drag lines between things. And that gives you a very low barrier to entry. So you start with a blank canvas and getting something quickly is very, very simple. So that's wonderful. You kind of get that initial dopamine hit and it's great and you want to keep doing it. After a while, once the model and the diagrams scale and get bigger, doing all of this through UI, I think, just becomes hugely complicated. So imagine you've got like 120 software systems in your model or something, and you add a new one and it has to connect to 40 of the other software systems. You now have to go through the GUI and tick the boxes and draw the arrows, and it just becomes time consuming. So I kind of stuck to my guns and said, right, I'm just going to do an as code approach. The initial versions of the structurizer tooling were write some Java code to get the models. And I still think it's really cool, but no one wanted to use it because it's Java and Java's horrible and old and enterprise and whatever. Yeah, whatever. So during COVID, I had nothing to do. So I built the structurizer DSL, which you're right, it's a kind of very lightweight domain specific language and allows you to define a person or a software system or a container in the words in the language of the C4 model. And it's really just a wrapper on top of the existing Java library. So all of the fancy features that I built into the Java library, you kind of get for free through the DSL. And the DSL is very succinct, so you don't have to write a lot of DSL. It's got some cool features where it can imply, so if you connect up components across software systems, it will bubble up those relationships to the software system to software system level automatically. So it trims down the number of relationships you have to add. For example, It's all model based. You can create multiple views of a single text file, a single model. Styling is consistent across the entire thing. So there's just lots of stuff that's kind of done for you. And as you say, it's text and it's human readable. And it turns out it's also AI readable. So this is kind of why I'm sticking to my guns in our new AI era. It turns out it's reasonably trivial to get LLMs to generate this stuff. I just added some MCP tooling, which runs the validation and parsing commands on a server. And there's enough information in the error messages to feed back to the LLMs that they can actually fix the problems when they generate invalid code. So this is all super simple now. The feedback loop is wonderful.
Yeah.
So that's why I'm sticking to code.
Okay. Fair. I accept your answer. Yeah. No, I think it's kind of one of the benefits of the AI era. It's like there's almost no excuse to maintain or curate a reasonable set of docs and do all the other stuff that might have gotten short shifted, like with, because coding was the focus, and it was just like typing and like, let's put these symbols in an editor. So yeah, that's awesome. I love that. So a little bit more about the just kind of ecosystem around your DSL. So you've got a canvas a viewer, right, that will view this kind of stuff. Like tell me a little bit more about what supports what is the apparatus that supports this AI driven or even just docs as code kind of mentality.
Yeah, so because I've been building this for 10 years, there's like tons of stuff. And I think there's tons of stuff people have never seen before. But the basic approach is this: you write some DSL in a text file, and then you have to render it somehow. So I've built a bunch of tooling that allows you to boot up a server either on your laptop kind of locally for fast feedback loops, or you can spin up a centrally hosted managed server and kind of publish these text files to it. Essentially, that gives you a nice browser-based UI where you can move the boxes and arrows around. So when I first built this tooling, I wasn't happy with automatic layout. If you've ever seen Plant UML or Mermaid, it always gets the boxes in the wrong places and you kind of can't move them. So my structurizer tooling, the aim of it was to do as much rendering as possible, except for moving the boxes and the lines, because that's what humans are good at, because you want to tell a story, essentially. So that's why I built this whole kind of browser-based UI, manual layout. The layout is stored separately from the DSL, but there's a whole merging algorithm, and all of this thing is also still text. So that's kind of the basics of the tooling ecosystem. There's a bunch of CLI tools, and there's also a bunch of CLI tools that allow you to export the views in your structurized DSL files to Plant UML and Mermaid. So this is kind of interesting. I see lots of people these days trying to automatically generate C4 diagrams using AI with Mermaid.
Mm-hmm.
But the problem with Mermaid is, although there is a C4 type language in Mermaid, Mermaid doesn't understand C4. It doesn't understand the semantics of the abstractions, and it doesn't understand the rules around the specific view types in C4. So, for example, this means you can add a C4 component to a system context diagram in your Mermaid code, which is not really allowed with the C4 model. So you can ask your LLM instead to generate the structurized DSL. All of the C4 rules are kind of baked into the DSL. It won't parse if you try and mix and match all these different levels of abstraction and put the wrong types of abstractions on the diagram types where they're not expected. And then you can export those things to Plant UML or Mermaid if you still need those formats as a part of your toolchain, for example. So yeah, my structurizer tooling is rendering tool independent, but I provide a nice kind of browser-based UI essentially for doing manual layout and diagram viewing.
Nice. Awesome. So let's go into C4 a little bit. And, we kind of joked up front that maybe it's C2+2, or when we were talking about doing a podcast, you're like, maybe it's C7. I'm like, maybe it's C6 plus D. I don't know, whatever. Everyone's got an issue with naming. But what are some of like slept on diagrams? So we know landscape system context, the container component code, etc. What are some of the diagrams that people miss out on that you think deserve consideration?
Yeah. So let's list all of them. So C4 is system context, containers, components, and code. Those are the static structure diagrams. Those are the ones that most people will land on first. The system landscape diagram really sits on top. So a system landscape diagram is really just the same as a system context diagram, but it doesn't have a focus on a single system. It's like a wider view of the world. That's 5 done. There is a dynamic diagram, which is really just a sequence or collaboration style diagram that shows how a particular feature works at runtime. So this is how the sign-in feature works as a collection of collaborations through components or containers. That is a super useful diagram type. However, it's not also used all that much. So you're building a web app, you have 100 features. Should you build 100 of these dynamic diagrams, 1 per feature? No. In most cases, you've got recurring common patterns across your code base to maybe document the patterns and then say everything else is like an instance of this style of pattern. Use it to document complicated sets of interactions, maybe between systems. So an interesting diagram type, but I don't think used all that much. I think the most interesting one is actually the deployment diagram. So you have your container diagram that shows applications and data stores inside your software system. What many people make the mistake of is that they then superimpose their cloud environment, only their production cloud environment, on top of their container diagram, which is kind of the wrong way to do it. So the C4 container diagram is designed to be an environment agnostic view of your system. So this is the set of applications and data source that exists inside your software system boundary. And then you'd have a version in your dev environment, a version in test, and a version in production, for example. So the deployment diagram allows you to create 1 deployment diagram per unique deployment environment. So when your new devs join, you can say, here's the development environment. This is how you set up your development environment. These are all the Docker images we're using. And your production deployment shows your cloud infrastructure with VPCs and VPNs and all of that good stuff. So I think that's the most slept on diagram. It's really helping people split the container diagram from the infrastructure.
Yeah, that's interesting. That kind of changes a little bit. I'm learning something here. Have traditionally kind of munged my container and deployment diagrams to where, my containers will be like, oh, this is a React bundle being served over S3, and this is a, so I kind of would get the thing. So you're just saying the container is like almost the logical, or that it's physical, but it doesn't map on the environmental or the tech stacks and stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, there are some technologies when you can't get away from that. So if you're building something using Amazon Web Services and you're using a specific AWS service and there's no dev environment for it, and you're literally using the cloud version, then sure, you have to kind of say this is running in some AWS service on the cloud. But yeah, for most cases, it's an environment agnostic view of that thing. So I'll give you a real simple example. If you look at the C4 model website, there's a bunch of example diagrams for an internet banking system. And you've got all of the usual suspects on there. There's a front end and a back end and a data store, whatever. So imagine you have a user interface, like a single page app running in your web browser. When you open up your web browser, you need to load that UI from somewhere. It doesn't just magically appear. You have to load the UI from somewhere. So on the C4 container diagram, for the example, I say that we have a C4 container, which is just representing the static content. So in other words, all of the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So that's kind of the environment agnostic view of that container. In the dev environment, we then mount that folder into an Nginx server running inside a Docker container. So that's the dev environment. And the live environment is that same static content container pushed into an S3 bucket and served out of the S3 bucket by a Cloudflare, a DNS CNAME, for example.
Okay.
So that's kind of a nice example of where you can show those very different deployments of essentially a set of files on disk.
Interesting. Yeah. Okay. Awesome. That's really cool. So I'll just paraphrase for comprehension. The container diagram is tech agnostic. So
it's not tech agnostic, it's deployment environment agnostic.
Deployment environment agnostic. Okay. And then the deployment diagrams layer that in for a given environment, dev, test, prod, whatever.
Yep.
Okay. Awesome. That will help me. I'll return to dynamic diagrams for a minute, and I just want to make a PSA for anyone listening here that I think dynamic diagrams are an excellent way to talk about change or to, I mean, certainly they're a great way to kind of show key, you know, flows or key data flows, message flows, how the thing works, but they're also a really interesting way to think about like more ambitious architectural or design changes and to look at how things work in their current state and then maybe, how then start talking about how we might want them looking in the future state. I think like one of the things that comes up over and over again when I'm working with groups and there's C4 in the conversation is how do we represent change in time? Like how do we represent time dimension being like a message flow or a user initiates this request and it goes through these systems and integrations and look how deep this is and maybe that's a problem or, those kind of conversations come up. Changes, we have an incumbent architecture and we want to change it in some way, extract a service, kind of start carving up a monolith, whatever, those kinds of conversations. How do you use C4 to I know this is a huge question, right? But how do you use it to you got it, man. How do you represent change in time with what is fairly static structure? Like, what are your tips for that?
Yeah, again, you have a bunch of options, and the tooling that you use is going to help you or hinder you here. So let's go back to good old days. You've got a current state architecture diagram sitting in Visio, and there's a bunch of changes you're going to make over the next 6 months. The way that people typically do that is copy paste the architecture diagram, create a future state version, and then they'd kind of add and remove boxes, and maybe just some color coding. But then you've got kind of two duplicates. So what I tend to recommend with, and this definitely works with my tooling, and it probably works with other tooling as well, is you still maintain your base architecture diagram. And then, I'm trying to figure out how to explain this without explaining like everything around it. So imagine you have your structure as a DSL file that describes your current state architecture. Using my tooling, you can extend that version of the architecture. So there's a whole extension mechanism built in, and you can add things to the model essentially. So if you've got purely additive changes, that's one approach. So you start with the base version, extend it, and add the things that are going to be changed. Add the things that are going to be added. If you've got changes, you might want to modify the model as it stands, but in my structurized tooling, there's a tagging mechanism. So you can attach a future state tag to things that are going to be present in the future state. And then you can craft up different views. So you can say, here's the current state view, and it only shows you the things that are not tagged future state. And then you can say, here's the future state view, and it shows you everything that's not tagged and also has the future state tag, for example. So that's kind of one way to do it as well. You can also just put everything in one picture, use different colors. So like red for things that are being removed, green for things that are being added, blue for things that are going to change. You're going to have to watch for color deficiency, for example, red, green. So don't overly roll out on color. So yeah, you have a bunch of different options really depending on the tooling that you're using.
Interesting. Yeah, cool. Yeah, I've kind of done the more manual route where it's like, okay, we'll have, our diagrams in some tool that isn't as connected and nice as the tooling that you've created. We'll try and create a future state, and then we kind of just put them up side by side, and we'll say, okay, here's the color coding or whatever. Yeah, cool. Yeah, I think these things are just so useful when we're talking about things that extend past your normal refactoring boundary, like architecture changes. If we're not trying to court a big rewrite risk, if we're trying to just like maneuver, like in small little Kent Beck style refactoring ways, but like in slightly bigger ways, like stepwise maneuvering versus like just trying to recreate the whole thing, get to feature parity and, all the problems that come with that. Cool. Okay. So because you've worked with so many people on this, I want to talk about embellishments. And there's always like, you do this workshop and people are very creative. They'll create little, without even thinking about it, extensions. And that's something that could be habit or, just this is the way I've done it. But like, I'd love to talk about the embellishments that you think are useful on top of C4, where you think preserving some of the constraints that you've developed with the model should be respected. And then are there any kind of funny things that you've seen in your workshops, like people trying to do that maybe they should or should not do?
In terms of embellishments, I see quite a lot of flair from a visual angle. So people love adding icons and making all the different people, different shapes, and having ties and hats and all sorts of crazy stuff on. So I've seen lots of kind of visual embellishments, but they're not really fundamentally changing what C4 is about. And of course, C4 is notation independent anyway. I guess it's more the tooling aspect. I've seen people take C4 and add things on top of. So I know people who are putting all their C4 models and diagrams into a tooling, and then they are exporting that to some sort of, I was going to call it a data lake. It's not a data lake, but some sort of architecture repository. And then they're able to do queries on it. So show us all of the teams who are using technology X, for example. So if you've got like the log4j thing that happened a few years ago, you can just ask it a question: who's potentially using log4j, flag them up and send them an email. So yeah, I've seen people stick all the stuff in a centralized model and then query it, report it. So that's kind of super useful. In terms of things that people do that I don't like, yeah, there's actually quite a few of these. How long have we got? When I run my workshops, we typically only draw system context and container diagrams. And that's really because you don't need to go all the way down to level 4 to get the idea of C4. And we can do it quite quickly. The whole thing takes like 90 minutes. I have seen a temptation, because the case study I generally use, unless we're doing the client's thing, that the case study I use is quite small and quite simple. And I have seen people collapse the context and container view into a single picture. So you get the outer rectangle, which will represent the system. So they'll draw their system context diagram, but they'll make their system really big, visually really big. And then they'll put the containers kind of nested inside as smaller boxes. And, you know, that kind of works. And it works here because it's a small system and it's not particularly complicated. But that approach doesn't work in the real world. You just end up getting too much in one picture and you get back to that horrible situation. So that's one thing I don't really like people doing. Some people will ignore my notation advice, which kind of irritates me a little bit, because we have this whole section about, like, make sure you write out the full names of the systems and make sure you like describe the arrows. And sometimes people will miss out the tech choices or miss out the arrow labels. And we can kind of fix that easily. I have a nice little review checklist now. You can either chuck the diagrams into AI and have it review it for you. I think the biggest thing I've seen is people taking C4, like, okay, we get C4, but our world is more complicated. Our world's bigger. So we want to take C4 and we want to add more things to it. Now, what's the word I'm looking for? I think that's fine, right? Taking C4 as a starting one and kind of adding more levels of abstraction is fine. But for me, it's an advanced maneuver. It's an advanced technique that you should only do if you really, 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 really need to. And in most cases, I've modeled or I've helped teams model most software systems at most sizes and levels of complexity with just those 4 levels of abstractions. So what are some of the things people want to model as unique abstractions in C4? It's stuff like DDD bounded contexts. It's stuff like libraries and modules and things like architectural layers. So let's take DDD bounded context. And this actually cropped up earlier this week. Imagine you're building a monolithic application. You've got like 50 components inside it. And it turns out those 50 components are really like 4 or 5 bounded contexts. And those components are inside the bounded context. People want to create a bounded context abstraction that sits between the container and the component level. I'm like, is a bounded context an abstraction? I'm not sure it is. For me, a bounded context is really just a grouping. It's like an organizational structure around the C4 abstractions. Similarly with architectural layers, have you ever drawn those architecture layer diagrams, which is like UI thing pointing to business thing pointing to data thing? Right, me too. It's utterly pointless. It literally tells you nothing because all of the complexities inside those 3 layers So that's why I kind of say to people, yeah, an architectural layer is not really a level abstraction. It's just a grouping of containers that are kind of residing inside that architectural layer. And I've also seen people who want to create kind of component and subcomponent set of abstractions. So they have these really gigantic components and they consider them to be logically made up of small components. So they want to add multiple levels of components. And I'm like, you can do that if you want to, but in order to do that, you need to make sure you write down somewhere how you've taken C4 and modified it. And this is the whole thing. One of the criticisms I get of C4 is that it's too rigid. Because there are only 4 levels of abstraction, C4 is too rigid and it's not flexible enough to model the types of real-world systems that we want to model. And then they start adding these new abstractions like components inside components, but they don't put the effort in to properly define what these levels of abstraction are. So then, of course, people come along, they follow the same pattern, but they don't really understand what a component inside a component actually means. And you get back to the situation we had 20 years ago, which is diagrams literally showing everything.
Yeah.
If defining levels of abstraction was easy, we wouldn't be doing any of this. We wouldn't be having this conversation, for example. So I think the whole thing about clearly defining levels of abstraction is super difficult. And this is why I think adding more levels of abstraction to C4 is an advanced technique, and it's not really suitable for most people.
Well, it sounds a little bit too like, I'll put words in your mouth, but I got this from you, or this idea. I don't know if this is canon, but if you go and start to add complications to your C4 model, that's a good indication that what you're modeling might be, excessively or, complex. Like it's a signal to you that maybe you've got too much abstraction in your actual code base or your head, I feel like the constraints of C4 should be there to keep you honest about managing complexity in a way, and like, if you pay attention to that instinct to want to break it and build it in the image of the thing you've got, you should stop and check yourself and say, is the thing I've got operating with the right abstractions at all? Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. And on a kind of related note is we're terrible across the industry at using words properly. Right. You see this all the time, I'm sure. So you'll be having conversations with somebody and they'll say, microservices should not share a database. I don't know. Is that good or bad? Are we talking about a database server or a schema? Like, all of these things, once we put more precise words around them, have very, very different meanings. And that's one of the benefits of C4. It's about forcing people to have the conversations. When you say database, what is it you exactly mean here? And how's it represented in C4? So yeah, I'm a huge fan of making sure that teams have I'm going to steal the DDD term, a ubiquitous language to describe the architectural structures that exist inside their code bases. And I don't think we do a good enough job of doing that.
Yeah, makes sense. That's great.
It's my little rant for the day.
Okay, and rant. I mean, literally. I mean, what time is it in Jersey? I mean, you should be 3 rants in.
5.
Okay, that's good. It's good to control your rants, I guess. That way they maybe carry some weight. So yeah, I mean, I had a kind of set of questions around C4 and the AI moment we're in, and really maybe you kind of did a good job of, explaining how you can use LLMs for linters, or you could use LLMs to kind of generate model, the DSL code. I'm kind of just curious, how are you using AI? Beyond C4, like, what do you see as some of the kind of trends that are happening that are likely to create some knock-on effects around? Anytime we get a new tech, we abuse it, and it creates all kinds of consulting opportunities. I'm really just using you here to figure out what to do with my life in the next 3 years. But yeah, what do you see like happening with AI? What are you doing, and what are you kind of seeing as like problems that arise with a new tech like this?
Yeah, so I think my plan is to go on holiday or vacation for about 3 years and then re-enter the industry and go and fix all of the stuff I see happening at the moment. Honestly, there's some horrendous stuff going on. So I've been doing C4 and the structurizer thing for like 10, 15 years now. And no one else has really been doing diagrams and architecture diagrams and things like this. I'm not kidding. This year, I've seen 20 new diagramming tools. 20. All of them vibe coded with AI. They're all horrible. They create terrible diagrams. They have no anything. So that situation's a whole mess. I've seen lots of people vibe coding stuff, and I'm sure you have too. And what do I think of vibe coding? I don't know. Maybe there's some real use for it if it's narrow and you're willing to put some discipline and effort into figuring out if what you've got is useful. There are definitely some use cases here for developers to automate some of the mundane tasks. But again, you have to keep these AI LLMs in check. Something, and you can see this quite easily for yourself. If you go and do a quick search on GitHub and look for repos that are using AI, one of the easiest ways to do this is to go and find who's using things like CodeRabbit. So CodeRabbit is an AI pull reviewer, essentially. And what I've found is when you kind of look at some of these repos, you've got CodeRabbit, which is assessing the quality of the pull requests and making suggestions and all that stuff, which is good. However, those repos have a lot more issues opened on them in the past 3 or 6 months than ever before. So I've seen some projects on GitHub, and you can see that a lot of code is now being created by LLMs, and they've got CodeRabbit kind of reviewing this stuff, but it's still going through to production essentially. But the number of issues has just gone up almost exponentially because there's stuff that's now just breaking. All the regression tests are breaking. I have no idea what's going on. And I think we're going to see that on a bigger scale across enterprise software development if we're not careful. On Reddit, so if you go to experienced devs on Reddit, there was a thing posted this morning, which I just thought was hilarious. And it said, we've been told by management that we must use AI for 80% of our activities. My goodness, that was a top-down mandate. That's a company, if you've got stock in, you want to get out as quick as you possibly can. And what's funny is in the comments, you see lots of other people going, oh yeah, we've had the same mandate. This whole thing is just massively overhyped at the moment. There's definitely some brilliant uses of AI, but the whole development thing is massively, massively overhyped. And this bubble is going to pop horribly at some point. We're going to see some. All it's going to take is one big failure of some critical software system that we're all relying on. And
I posted about the Anthropic strategy is like, I mean, they backed off on safety. Safety's still there, but like the Constitution, MD, and like stuff like that. And I'm not. It's kind of what I use, but I wouldn't classify myself as a fanboy. I'm too old to be, a brand loyalist at this point. I've aged out of the marketing demo of people that are excited about products to a degree, but it is very brilliant because it creates these failure conditions for other people to have big mess ups, which could be safety, societal level things. And it kind of makes their position look really smart, because they're kind of a little bit more safety concerned, especially right now in the US when there's just, it's a mess, there's the regulation is go bye-bye, it's crazy. This is not a politics podcast, so we'll stop there. But yeah, I think you're right. I think I'm kind of betting along the same lines. I mean, I think I'm trying to learn how to kind of use the AI with a short leash and kind of, I found like a lot of my XP tricks work really well. Like when I speak in BDD, like I get much better results, and it's like I'm giving it one scenario at a time kind of thing. I have started to think about the multi-agent stuff, but it just seems crazy to me. Like I still want to see it and react to it and then shape it, and intentionally and still know what's going on under the hood. And if something new happens, it's a learning opportunity. I need to stop, drop, and roll. But who knows, man? Hopefully we're right.
There was a post on LinkedIn, I think last week, and somebody had built a dashboard to control all the agents they were running all the time concurrently. They had like 10 agents running at a time, but they needed to build a dashboard to manage the agents. I'm like, oh my goodness, what is going on?
Yeah.
That's just mind-blowing.
Multitasking,
it's really
run
clever or really stupid, and I honestly don't know which one it is.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, I kind of can see like I want to have a dozen or so agents that are just doing life things. Like, tell me when this client does an earnings report and sum it up to me. Like, that's something we do manually now that I would just want to have, we're kind of using Notion agents for that, right? So I kind of get that part of it. Like, but as far as software, enterprise software engineering, I just feel like governance really matters. And it's going to be like an airplane. Like, it would be really weird to look in the cockpit and just see a server rack. You know what I mean? Like, we know we could fly these things, but still, I would be thinking about it that whole flight.
Yeah.
If Waymo got into was acquired by Delta or something. Anyway, cool. All right. So I think, yeah, I mean, I got all my questions answered. I do want to kind of wrap up here with this question about regional styles. And, you know, this comes up in our conversations, and like, I'm token American, you're token Jersey dude. But as you've done work in the US and like, let's just say the US and kind of more European or UK, how do you notice like developer cultures being a little bit different? Because I definitely notice them being different. Yeah. This is your chance to be spicy on the way out.
Yeah. So should I ask you how you think they're different first? And then
I'll do,
say, yes,
I think
agree.
that's fair. I think that's fair. Okay. Americans, show me the money. Cash, cash, cash. Let's get her done. It's very like individualistic, rugged, like very like driven toward results and the financial incentives, I would say. Whereas my time in the UK and the, you know, dozen or so European conferences I've been to, the vibe is much more about intellectualism. It's much more about, I mean, not to say that's better, because they can be assholes too, but you know, it's very much more like, what do you know? What have you done lately? What are your cool thoughts? Like, kind of thing. So that's how I recognize it. It's like US is very practical, results, money driven. You know, Europe seems a little bit like, even the software architecture scene out there was much more fresh and cool, you know, back in the tens, you know what I mean? Like when I was kind of going out there a lot. I don't know. Just interesting to me.
So I kind of agree, I think. So I've probably done 95+% of my workshops in and around Europe, done a few bits and pieces, Asia, Middle East, that sort of thing. And I've only really done a handful, like a small number of a small number of workshops in the US over the past 10 or 15 years. And my experience of the teams I worked with is that there's just a lot more friction in the US. There's a lot more people. Stuff takes a lot longer to get done. So let me caveat this before I get into trouble. I've not visited California, so I've not done workshops in California, Silicon Valley, San Francisco, all of that sort of stuff. So if you kind of carve that piece out of America, I'm going to talk about the rest of the country.
Sure.
I've kind of mostly done workshops with big, typical kind of US enterprise companies. And there just seems to be lots of friction, lots of overhead, lots of bureaucracy. I don't think it's as efficient as what I see in Europe. Also in Europe, there seems to be a much better kind of learning culture. So learning is a part of the culture of the organizations. It's something that the organizations want to impart on their employees. They want them to grow and that sort of thing. And I just didn't get that same vibe from the US companies I visited. Again, caveats apply, not visited California, only visited a small number of US companies. But it just seems to be very, very different culturally. And I've had a number of people say to me that they think Europe is more advanced in terms of software development. And I've kind of always struggled with that because, again, I've never kind of visited California in anger. But I tend to agree. If you take kind of corporate America versus corporate Europe, I'd give the edge to Europe. But again, I'm European. There's a bias there.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I like working out there, man. I feel like I felt more at home in London than certainly, I don't know. I mean, I feel pretty home in Minneapolis. I'm not gonna bet, you know, that's my second home. But like, you know, I mean, even New York, you know, it just felt like more natural and more fun to be out there from a developer community perspective. I felt more like vibrant, you know, in a way.
Yeah.
But, you know, I don't know. It's probably bad to end this thing with generalities and stereotypes, but it is something I pay attention to. Yeah.
Have you visited Canada?
I have on occasion. I've done a lot of like more leadership things out there, but I mean, I love it. I'm actually weirdly going out to Toronto next week and then for another gig the week after. So I'll have to report back.
Do you think Canada's more like America or more like Europe?
I'm not going to, no comment. I mean, I think we've gone as far with this topic as we can.
And thanks for joining us, folks.
Yeah, yeah. They're cooler in a way, they're definitely nicer,
Are they different?
I don't know. Yeah, different, I guess. There's this book, I'm having a senior moment, I can't bring it up, but it's all like the communication patterns from around the globe and how people go into like negotiation meetings and deals, and I'll put it in the show notes and I'll send you a link, but it kind of visualizes it. You'll like it because it kind of, I don't know, maybe you saw that meme 5-6 years ago, but I don't know, just something I'm seeking to understand, especially as we talk to international people, especially at this time, All right, Simon. Well, look, I would love for you to kind of plug some of the things going on. I know you got a new O'Reilly book that's coming out soon. Like, what should people be consuming from the Simon Brown collection?
So, probably the O'Reilly book. So the O'Reilly book is really you can think of as the. Let me start again. You can think of it as the second edition of my LeanPub C4 model book. So I wrote the C4 model book, put it on LeanPub, self-published about 10 years ago. I already picked that up last year, so we signed the contract.
Nice.
My initial thought was I'm just going to copy and paste it into a Google Doc, and that'll be that. But I end up rewriting literally the whole book. So it's almost twice the size, tons more examples, much more guidance. So grab that when it comes out. The first 6 chapters are already available in early access on the O'Reilly platform, but the whole book is done in first draft. So yeah, that would be my recommendation. Get all the latest C4 advice.
And what's the link tree for you? Like, where do people go to find your open source stuff, like your online stuff, like that's already there?
Probably simonbrown.je.
Okay.
The .je is the Jersey thing, of course.
What's the surfing like in Jersey in March? Too cold?
I went surfing last week. It was okay.
Nice. All right.
A little bit choppy, but it's okay.
You got it. All right. Well, Simon Brown, thank you so much, friend, for having this conversation with me. I learned a lot.
No worries, thank you.
And I hope our listeners do too. Thanks again, Simon.
Cheers. Thank you.